So we will have to be the evangelist, I know, for what we learn this evening. And it's our honor to welcome Dr. Jeremy Horperdal, which is Norwegian. Is that right?
Mhm.
Okay. And he has a son named Soren.
I do, yes.
Yes. Which in the context of the church, that means Kierkegaard. But anyways, there it is. So anyways, Jeremy is assistant professor of economics at UCA and a scholar with the Arkansas Center for Research in Economics. And he's here with us this evening because he's also a contributor to Arkansas Week, which is sort of that wonderful program that gives us a snapshot of life in Arkansas every week. And that's where I first saw him and suggested that we invite him. Jeremy's going to talk with us about the economy, COVID and post-COVID. And that's going to include sort of understanding what the numbers really are traditional measures, good measures for what's happening, and then talking some about stimulus packages and what the impact of them is. So we're going to come away, I believe, with a lot to think about. And on that note, Jeremy, if you could just go ahead and lead us on, and I guess the rest of us, if we can mute while we're listening to Jeremy, and we'll open up for discussion and questions once he's spoken with us.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Jeff, and thanks, Jeff and Pat, for inviting me to do this. I'm happy to be here, and what better thing to do on a cold night like this when you can't go anywhere than talk about economics. That's what I always say. My students might disagree. We did our classes virtually today due to the snowstorm, and some of them were excited to be there, but I think some just wanted a real snow day. But anyway, we'll go ahead and talk about this, and you know, I want to talk about the economy and how the pandemic has affected the economy, especially Arkansas's economy, but also to talk about maybe how it, you know, to speculate towards the end about whether there might be some fundamental changes about how our economy works and what the future of people working looks like. Before I get to the economic data, I did want to share with you a little bit of data just on kind of the health statistics from the pandemic. I remember at the last presentation last month, someone had a question at the end, which, you know, I think we've heard this question a lot about. You know, we hear all these numbers every day and every week about how many people have died from COVID-19, and there's always a lot of confusion about, you know, are those deaths, which, you know, would some of those have happened anyway? You know, how many of those actually represent a real increase in the number of people that died? So this is some, you know, as an economist, I focus mostly on data about the economy, but economists love to just look at any kind of data. So I've been collecting data on this as well. So I'll just, before I get to the economy data, I'll just briefly share with you some data I have on this question about the death statistics. And just to quickly sum it up before I get to the data, really, you know, when you hear those death numbers reported in the news every day, they really do represent an actual increase in the number of deaths from what we would normally expect. For the most part, they aren't just deaths being coded as, you know, COVID-19 when they might have died from something else anyway. These do represent more deaths than we've experienced in Arkansas in kind of any recent year. So here's a chart I put together. This is looking at data for Arkansas, and I've done it by month for 2019 and 2020. So here we can see, if you look here you can see this is January. So the dark bar is January 2019 and the light bar is 2020. So this is all deaths. So this has nothing to do with how they were coded. Was it the flu? Was it a car accident? Was it cancer? This is just total number of deaths in Arkansas. And so we can see here in January, you know, this is before the pandemic hit and before anyone had maybe even heard of COVID-19. We heard about maybe something happening in China, but as we can see, you know, 2020 and 2019 are pretty comparable, right? I mean, it looks like 2020 bar is a little shorter, but, you know, there's kind of random variation. February is almost exactly the same. So, you know, before the pandemic hits and even into March, 2020 didn't look unusual at all. Then we can see as we go out here in the months, we can see that the light colored bar for 2020 starts getting taller and taller for each of the months. And to the point where if you look at December, we can see that December 2020 had 1,000 more deaths in Arkansas than December of 2019. And so I put this red line in here to show the cumulative of how many more deaths there were in 2020 than 2019. And it comes out to be about 4,700 more deaths in Arkansas. That represents something like an 18% increase in deaths. So I think a lot of us have been following these numbers. They come out every day. They tell us how many people died, and what's the totality of it though? Have more people died? And we can say definitely yes. I stop here in December because the good data on deaths, death is never, we don't want to say it's good, but the good data where we can actually compare comes in with a pretty long lag. So actually December is the most recent data we can really look at. So far in 2021, we've had another reported about 1,000 COVID deaths in Arkansas. So, that those would be added on top of this. But what we can see is that, the numbers you might have heard about the number of COVID deaths in Arkansas pretty closely lines up to the increase. And this is not just because 2019 was a unusually low year, maybe that was the reason, but it was not. So if we look here, here I gathered data all the way back to 1968. So this is looking at what's called the crude mortality rate. It's just the number of deaths in Arkansas divided by the population, and it's per 100,000 people. So this is how many people die for a total 100,000 population. You can see this is pretty consistent here for almost the entire period from say about 1970 up to about a few years ago. It's about 1,000 people per 100,000, right? So that's about 1% of the population dies per year. Here we can see this is the 2020 spike from the best data we have right now, and we can see it's a higher death rate than we've had as far back as I could find data, much higher than any other year. There's another statistic where they adjust for the age structure of the population. As the population ages, you actually would expect there to be more deaths, just because the older you are, the shorter your remaining life expectancy is. That's how life works. So when we adjust it for age, we can see, it is, still a significant increase. But getting back to death rates we would have seen in the mid 1980s. So pretty significant increase in death in Arkansas, however we look at it. And that's similar for the United States. So I put the same chart together for the United States, where you look at the month of 2020 compared to 2019. And then here's the cumulative excess deaths. And here we can see that for all of 2020 compared to 2019, there were about 500,000 more deaths in the United States than there were in 2019. And once again, that's not because 2019 was some sort of low year. If we look at, this is another chart I put together. This looks at how much higher deaths were compared to the previous 5 years. So this is, in each year, so this is 2020 compared to the previous 5 years for the entire United States, almost 20% higher than the previous 5-year average. And you can see the death rates do vary. Some years are a little higher than the past, some are a little lower, but this kind of spike of 20% higher, you never see that other than a major pandemic. So here's the 1918 influenza pandemic, where it was 33% higher. That was the last time it was this bad, and that was worse. So we're not quite as bad as that, but this is a major increase in death. And you've got pandemic years in here. So there's a 1968 flu, it barely shows up on this. There's a 1959 flu, barely shows up. So this is pretty significant increase. So what you can conclude from all this is, yes, what we've heard about the deaths, those are real deaths. They're deaths that were probably would not have happened without the disease. So all that means that, all the economy data I'm going to talk about, that's pretty serious data as well. But the two are very much related. We've had a lot of people adjusting their behavior based on the seeing all these deaths. You've had a lot of government restrictions for various business activities. In Arkansas, those mostly ended in the summer. But all those things then affect the economy, affect how much people can work, how much businesses can be open, and also how much people are spending money in the economy. So there's all the data on deaths, and at the end we can definitely come back and and I can answer questions about this too. I've tried to track this pretty closely, just out of personal curiosity. What's going on with the pandemic. So I think we can definitely say this was 2020 was a very bad year, and once we can all get vaccinated and can move on, it will be a very great thing. So let's talk about some numbers now about the economy. So here is probably a measure of the labor force you've seen before, the unemployment rate. It's reported every month. And so here's the most recent data. On the next slide, I'll show you the trends, but here's the most recent data. This is for December of 2020. Again, this comes out with a little bit of a lag. So we'll get the January numbers, I think, next week. So here's the most recent. Here we can see that Arkansas, with a 4.2% unemployment rate, is actually doing pretty good compared to the rest of the country. The lowest states are around 3%. So that's like South Dakota and Vermont and Utah are around 3%. The overall unemployment rate in the US is 6.7%. So Arkansas at 4.2%, we have seemed to, at least our economy has weathered this better than most other states have. So we're lower than the national average. We're lower than all the other states we border. In fact, even states like Texas and Louisiana, which also haven't had too many restrictions on their economy, been kind of similar to Arkansas, they have much higher unemployment rates still today. For the nation as a whole, there's about 10 million more people unemployed than there were before the pandemic. But that really varies a lot. So, places like California, Nevada, Colorado, New York, New Jersey, unemployment is way above what it would have been. Arkansas is getting close down to what our unemployment rate was even before the pandemic began, which was around 3.5%. So here's then looking at the trends. This is for Arkansas, our unemployment rate. The red line here shows the unemployment rate as traditionally measured. So that's where we've gotten back down to about 4%. Before the pandemic, we're at about 3.5%. But I think, as some of you might know, if you've thought about this a little bit and know what this number means, it may not perfectly measure how the labor market is doing, because if people drop out of the labor force, that is, they lose their job and they don't look for a new job, they're not actually counted as unemployed. You're only counted as unemployed if you're actively seeking work. And we do know that during the pandemic, a lot of people have simply stopped seeking work. They have personal issues of their own that they're having to deal with. There's just no jobs to look for right now. So many people probably feel like it's a waste of time, or at least certainly they did in the spring and the summer. So I've put together here, this is not anything that's officially published by the government, but I put together this alternate measure of unemployment that counts anyone who leaves the labor force also as being unemployed. So anyone who would have been in the labor force at the beginning of 2020, if they lose their job and they stop looking for work, I'm going to say they're still unemployed, even though officially they are not. So with that, we can see that the unemployment rate gets much higher than the official rate. So the official rate gets up to about 10.5% in Arkansas. Really, it was about 16% of the potential labor force that would have been working before the pandemic that loses their jobs. And this does take a while to come down, but really just really in December, we saw a pretty big decrease in the unemployment rate with people getting back to work. Somewhat, sadly, as we looked at the data on deaths, that December was the worst month for COVID deaths in Arkansas. So good news on the economic side that a lot of people are getting back to work. But that's coinciding with some of our worst months for the pandemic as far as the health conditions. We can see here that at the end in December, this alternative unemployment rate I've constructed for Arkansas gets down to about 6%, whereas the official rate is at 4%. So we're not actually really quite back to normal yet, but we've come a long way. And some states have actually started seeing their unemployment rates go back up in December as new restrictions were put on businesses in some states. So Arkansas is definitely moving in the direction. I do wonder, and this is always hard to know, I do wonder though, if it was, our increasing participation in the economy, both as workers and consumers, that's actually driving some of the higher cases, especially if we looked at December and January. But that's what the unemployment rate looks like. So that's one of the more widely used measures of how the labor market is doing. But if we want to look at how the overall economy is doing, one of the most commonly used statistics is called the gross domestic product. And maybe if some of you have taken economics classes, maybe you're having flashbacks, nightmares now to this number and trying to memorize what it means. But the simplest version of what GDP means is it's just all the economic activity that happens. It's adding up all the spending by consumers and the investment by businesses and the spending by governments. It's adding all that up and saying how much in total is their economic activity. And we usually look at this number to say how much has it changed. So in most years, this number is going up a little bit. Right? It's going to go up about 2 or 3% per year. That's kind of normal. If we look at what's going on now in Arkansas, and for this, the most recent data is for the third quarter. So this data comes out quarterly rather than monthly. But if we compare kind of before the pandemic, so the fourth quarter of 2019 to our most recent data, the third quarter of 2020, we can see that almost every state is down. Every state is lower than they were before the pandemic. The one exception is Utah. Utah, by the third quarter, it actually got back to where they were before. But no others, but Utah, and that was like almost exactly where they were. So no state has had any growth. Arkansas at a negative 3%, so that the total amount of economic activity is about 3% smaller than it was before the pandemic. That's a significant improvement from what it was in the second quarter. So the second quarter was the worst, if you saw that data, worst data ever on how bad the economy had shrunk compared to what it was before. In Arkansas, it shrunk about 10%. But so like the cumulative effect then is what this shows, is that Arkansas's economy is about 3% smaller, which is not good. That's a significant loss of people's income and spending. But we've recovered quite a bit from the worst of the pandemic. And once again, we see here that Arkansas is kind of in the best tier of states. So if you can see the legend down here, right, this dark blue is the best tier. These are the states that are closest to getting essentially back to normal. So the dark blue states here, right, the 10 ones that are dark blue are the ones that are closest back to normal. And the really light colored ones are the ones that still have a long way to go. Here we can see that Arkansas is once again better than the national average. The nation as a whole, the economy has shrunk by 4.5%, and we're better than all of our neighboring states. So, we compare ourselves to our neighboring states because our economies are much more connected, and we're experiencing maybe similar kinds of, we're experiencing the pandemic at the same time as people in your region. So it's a good group to compare to. And here we can see that Arkansas, a 3% shrinking of the economy is not good. Normally we expect 2 to 3% growth, and a bad year is 1 to 2% shrinking. But a 3% shrinking compared to what we had thought how bad it could have been, actually looks pretty good kind of on the back end of this. So we'll be looking for that fourth quarter data to come out. We've already seen the fourth quarter data for the entire nation, and then it takes them a little bit longer to show that for individual states. But the economy continued to recover in the fourth quarter, not quite as quickly as we might like, but we should see Arkansas getting back to very close to what it was before the pandemic once we have that fourth quarter data, which will be coming out, I believe later this month. So what goes into this number, gross domestic product? The biggest factor, again, you might remember this from your economics classes in college, the biggest factor is consumer spending. So that's one thing we can look at, is how has consumer spending changed? So here's some data I put together on consumer spending. And what we can see here is that consumer spending in Arkansas, when we look at the end of January, that's the most recent data I could get about 2 weeks ago. Consumer spending in Arkansas was actually 17% above what it was before the pandemic. So, we expect a little bit of an increase every year, again, 2 or 3% on most economic measures. But Arkansas pretty quickly, if you look at Arkansas, and this is the dark blue line here. So there you see on the key, Arkansas is the dark blue. We can see that, as the entire nation did and all states did, we had a really significant drop here in April and May. But notice that by June, Arkansas is kind of back to the spending levels that we had before the pandemic. So people were spending, as I'll show you in the next slide, they were spending money in very different ways than before, but people actually were spending money. Some of that might have been due to, some of it certainly was due to the government stimulus payments, right, which went out in kind of mid-April. But notice that Arkansas by mid-April was almost back to even. This is the even line here. we were almost back to normal even before those stimulus payments started. So certainly they helped a lot of people, support them with income they would have needed. But since most of those checks don't come till mid-April, we actually seen a lot of recovery already by then. And now consumer spending in Arkansas, at least in January, is 17% above normal. So, once we see some data for the first quarter of 2021 for the gross domestic product, which we won't get until probably until May. This data takes a long time for the data to come out, so we don't have the gross domestic product for the first quarter until after that quarter is well over. But this would suggest, since consumer spending is the biggest part of the economy, that we actually would be pretty close to being back to normal, at least in terms of overall spending. But I think as we probably intuitively know, and I think if you talk to a lot of people that run businesses, we know that the type of spending consumers are doing has changed dramatically. So here's a chart that shows that. Oh, and I'm just flip back to the last one. Also showed a few other states here. So this kind of gray colored one is the United States. Notice that for the United States, it's kind of funny. It's exactly back to where it was before the pandemic. So, it's gone up and down, but for the country as a whole, consumer spending was at the end of January 2021 was almost exactly where it was in January of 2020. So that's for the nation as a whole. But some states, like Texas, are actually a little bit down, right? And you can see some of these that are these kind of really fine lines behind here. These are other states. I only highlighted 3 of them. Some states are well below that, right? So Texas is still below where they were before the pandemic. Arkansas and Tennessee, though, are pretty well above it. So we've been some of the better performing states as far as people spending money. Again, I do always wonder if, here we have this big spike in spending at the end of December. It's a lot of that's holiday spending, but you kind of get that every year. But a lot more holiday spending in Arkansas. I do always wonder, how much did that contribute then to the spread of the virus throughout late December and January, when we had another almost 1,000 deaths in January. So December and January each had about 1,000 COVID-related deaths. So let's now look at the breakdown of that spending. This is just for Arkansas now. This is looking at, remember we saw overall spending is up about 17%. What we can see, though, is a big change in how people spend their money, right? Entertainment, recreation, things like that. That spending is way down. It's half of what it was before the pandemic. Now it had shrunk by, if you look at this light blue line, look at that, shrunk by 80%. I mean, people were just not spending money on going to concerts and going to museums and things like that. People were just not spending money on that, and people are still not, right? That is still way down. If you look at spending on hotels and restaurants, of course, that shrunk a lot, right? People stopped traveling as much. People stopped eating out. That slowly climbed back. And now here, that's about even, right? Up about 1% from last January. So people have started spending money at restaurants and hotels, that sector of the economy. Still a lot of jobs were lost in the interim. A lot of businesses suffered. But as far as consumer spending, it seems that in Arkansas, people are confident enough that they can go out and do that kind of spending. If we look at, though, here's a category which has gone up a lot, and that's retail spending. And this does not even include groceries. So groceries, I didn't put it on here, would be up about 20%. But if you look at other retail spending, so people just having money to spend and wanting to spend it on something, they're not spending it on entertainment and recreation. They're spending it on other forms of retail, clothing and gifts and all sorts of things like that, right? So people are spending 33% more, 34% more on retail goods than they were before the pandemic. So this is a dramatic shift in how people spend their money, which is going to have dramatic effects on the economy, right? That's going to mean that a lot of businesses that were involved in these industries that were down for a long time, and even restaurants and hotels, which are now back, the spending's back up, but a lot of businesses were not able to survive this period when it's so far down. So if we look at now, this is a measurement of the number of small businesses that are open. So if they're not open, it doesn't mean they've permanently shut down. We can't actually tell from this data whether they have permanently shut down. But we look at, in Arkansas, the number of small businesses open compared to January of 2020. By February of this year, it was actually down 25%. So there's a lot of businesses just still are not open, right? So that's going to be ones certainly in the industries that are affected, but a lot of that's also going to include, restaurants that might have closed permanently because they were not able to make it through the pandemic. Even though there was a lot of government support for the businesses through loans, there was a lot of support for the workers through unemployment insurance. A lot of that just, for some, it was just not enough, right? Maybe these were businesses that were struggling anyway, and this kind of pushed them over the edge. But a lot of those businesses just won't be coming back. So we can kind of see the effect of when consumers change their type of spending. But even after consumer spending comes back, a lot of small businesses are just no longer going to be open. Part of this also might be a shift from spending on small businesses to spending at larger retailers, right? So this is just data on small businesses, right? So if people reallocate their spending to, chain restaurants instead of local restaurants, maybe the chain restaurants can better, because they have a, more risk they can spread out through all their locations, or maybe they have more loans they can access. That might mean they have an easier time, and maybe some smaller restaurants might not be able to come back, right? Or if people are spending money at Amazon, right, on Amazon.com rather than spending at a local business, maybe some of those local stores have closed and they'll not be coming back. That's all data about exactly how many have permanently closed. That's going to take a while for us to have good data to know that. I'm sure you could see anecdotes in the newspapers all the time, but to know kind of the cumulative effect, it's going to take quite a while for us to know, what are all the effects of that on the spending and how that's going to affect businesses in the long run. Okay, so I have really kind of thrown at you a lot of data. So maybe I will like pause for a moment and see if you guys have questions, either about what any of this data means. I can go back and explain it a different way, or just if anyone had thoughts about, anything related to this, please feel free to share.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
On the GDP, I was interested that it was Mississippi and us that seem to be faring the best, and Mississippi and Arkansas often struggles for being the worst. How would you kind of explain that we're doing better than, Tennessee, Oklahoma?
Mhm.
Why would Mississippi and Arkansas fare so much better in this pandemic?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, and when we think about, faring well in this case, it means getting back to normal, right? And so I think to me, the simplest answer is that in Arkansas and Mississippi, you had a lot more people who were maybe just willing to go out and be active in the economy, um, maybe before it was even safe in some cases, right? So if you look at um, states, Mississippi is actually right up there with some of the highest death rates from COVID per capita. Um, they're kind of right in there in the mix with all the Northeast states and with South Dakota, which has been the worst in the Midwest. So maybe in Mississippi they're doing well because people went out and were active in the economy, both as workers and spending money, which is good for the economy, but might also lead to more spread of the virus and eventually more deaths. So, that's one reason it could be. I mean, it could have something to do with just the type of industries we have, and they maybe not requiring as kind of people to go out as much, perhaps. But that's just, I think the people being willing to participate in the economy, even despite the pandemic, to me seems like the most straightforward reason. Did you have any thoughts about why that might be, Mike?
I think you tapped into it with the correlation between death and the participation. You're going to have a better growth, but you're also going to pay a price for it.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah,
when
some
you,
of the other
when you,
states, like, and some of the other states, sorry to interrupt, but like New
yeah,
York,
I'm sorry,
New York,
the
New
North
York is still
Dakota,
way down, right? So New York is still way down,
yeah,
but most of their, and they have a very high death rate too, but most of their deaths happen way back in the spring, right? So for them, their economy isn't doing well now, but they also haven't had many deaths really since the spring. I mean, they've had some, but I mean, a lot of that had happened really in April, May. I mean, if you look at New York City, we talk about deaths being above normal. New York City in April of 2020, their deaths were, I have to check, it was something like 500% above normal in April of 2020. Just astonishing. And for all of 2020, New York City's deaths were 168% of normal. I mean, they just really got shocked by this. And I think that scared a lot of them into not participating in the economy, which is why their economy is still so far down. But they have, not had as many deaths lately. Whereas if you look at South Dakota, which is another one right in there with Mississippi, which has had, I mean, South Dakota famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, is the one state that never had any restrictions on business. Businesses were never closed down. They never had mask requirements. They never had anything, right? Every state had at least some of these, and some states had them for longer periods of time, but South Dakota never did any of that. North Dakota was close to that, but they actually did have some restrictions. South Dakota was the most open, and they now have, them and Mississippi are right up there with the Northeast states that got hit hard in terms of deaths. But South Dakota's economy has performed well, and they have now the lowest unemployment rate in the country. So that's kind of the trade-off, right? If people are participating in the economy will do well, but it probably means you're going to get more spread of a contagious disease. So that's a good question. Thanks. I think we're thinking along the same lines here, but other questions or thoughts on anything I've said so far? Because I've got plenty more, but I want to give you guys a chance now to ask any questions. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and move forward here. One other thing which is related to the economic state of Arkansas is how government tax revenue is doing. So there was a big worry when the pandemic hit. There was going to be a massive hit to tax revenue, and that you're going to have huge required cuts to government spending in Arkansas, and they did a lot of that. So, for example, at UCA, we were told in March that we were losing something like a third of our state's support in our budget for that previous year, which that was at the kind of towards the end of our fiscal year, which like the state runs through June. Now that wasn't taking away a third of our budget; it was a third of the state support, and the state support is maybe a quarter of our budget. But that's a pretty big taking back of revenue, just because they were so worried that tax revenue was just going to dry up. What we found, and here's the most recent data, this is for January of 2021. What we can see is that surprisingly, tax revenue, at least in Arkansas, where the economy has done pretty well, has been pretty robust. So if you know anything about the state government and the revenue they collect, the vast majority of the revenue comes from just three sources: taxes on individuals, taxes on corporations, income, and then the sales tax. Those combined are like 95% of state revenue. So you got some other stuff: alcohol, tobacco, gaming taxes. All those together are like 5% of the total. So these are the real big ones. What we can see here in the fiscal year so far. So the fiscal year starts in July. It runs July to June. So this data is showing 7 months of the fiscal year. So it's from July 2020 to January 2021. That's just the way the data comes out. What we can see here is that compared to the same period a year ago, which would have been before the pandemic hit, right? So this is comparing to data up through January of 2020. Tax revenue for these three sources, here's the percent difference. It's way above what it was in the previous year. Again, normally this is the kind of thing where it's 2 or 3% more every year. Here we see income taxes for individuals, 11% more than last year. Corporate income tax, 16% more. Sales tax, 7.5% more. Meaning overall, and some of these are down, like racing and gaming taxes are down, but they're such a small part of the total anyway. If you look at the overall tax revenue for Arkansas so far in this fiscal year, which nicely lines up to a time totally before the pandemic, which is the time up to January of 2020, we can see that we have about 10% more tax revenue than we had. This is also way more than the forecast. They did an updated forecast back in April when they saw it wasn't going to be maybe quite as bad as they had thought. We're 12% above what they had budgeted for. So state budget is actually doing great. A lot of cities and counties were worrying they're going to see, crazy things like 50% declines. They heard the economy is going to contract by 50%, which meant that their sales tax revenue would contract by 50%. A lot of them are actually up. If you look at local sales tax data. So, and this is because, people are still spending money. And so people are spending money. They have been throughout the pandemic, even though the form of it has changed, as we saw on the pictures I showed you earlier. Really by May and June, spending was back to what it was before the pandemic. What they were spending it on had changed. And some things they spend on, if you spend it on groceries, that's largely untaxed, especially for the state revenue, it's untaxed. But because they'd spent more on other forms of retail, all that meant there was just a lot more tax revenue. And now this seems rather strange that as the state government's meeting for their legislative session in the middle of a pandemic and a recession, they're actually talking about having a large surplus. And what are we going to do with the surplus? Which is, it's a nice problem to have, and much better than some of the kind of worst case scenarios, which we thought would have been possible when when those projections were made back in March and they started making cuts. So like universities like UCA, we've had for this fiscal year, our funding fully restored. They never gave us back the amount they took away back in March, but now for this year, funding's fully restored because tax revenue is back to normal. There's no reason for them to withhold money for this year. So we do have, good news as far as tax revenue is concerned. And I follow this data pretty closely too. I think I've been on Arkansas Week and Capitol View a few times talking about the tax data. Jeff, you might have seen me on there too. But the data looks good so far. So we'll have to see if that holds up, and if the economy keeps improving, this data will look good too, and that's good for everyone. So kind of last big thing I want to talk about is this question of how might this pandemic affect the future of work? Are we just going to go kind of back, once everyone's vaccinated, it'll take maybe till the summer. Will we just go back to the old way of doing things, or will some things significantly change? I think, one question that people ask is about, will the way people spend their money change, right? If people have had a year without eating out at restaurants, will they say, hey, that was actually kind of expensive and I saved a lot of money by eating just at home. Maybe I'm going to change my budget. Will people do that? We don't know, right? But that's something that economists are thinking about, and certainly people in the restaurant industry are thinking about whether those things will change. But the bigger kind of, or I guess the other picture I want to talk about is the future of work, and this big question about, will there be more remote work? Now, we know, of course, say up front, not all jobs can be remotely, right? The people that pick up my garbage can't do that by Zoom, right? Not everything can be done remotely, but a lot of the economy can actually be done remotely now. In some cases, it's not as good. In some cases, it might actually be better, right? So here's some data from surveys of, in this case, of employers. It's the first one I'm going to look at. This one, I tried to find a more recent one, but this is actually from April of 2020, so kind of right after the pandemic hits. And they asked employers in this survey a number of questions, but here's one they asked: how has having remote work within your organization functioned, right, compared to what you expected? And the kind of people that said it went worse than expected was very small. I mean, maybe they had a low bar, but actually, half of the people surveyed, half of the businesses surveyed said it went somewhat better or much better than expected, right? So that's these two bars here, people saying it went better than expected. So if it went better than expected, and keep in mind that there's already people remote work is what before the pandemic was somewhat unusual. Maybe 3% of the workforce did this, but it was not unknown. I went to graduate school in Washington, D.C. and got to know people that worked at, think tanks out there. And a lot of them would eventually just kind of move closer to family and work out a deal with their employer to work mostly remotely, to fly back once a month on their own dime, right? The employer's not going to pay for that. And they thought that was better. They could live somewhere it was cheaper to live than Washington, D.C. They could be close to their family, or they could just live, if they want to live in a more, rural area, they could do that. And, I knew a few people that did this, right? And 3% of the workforce does that essentially. Given that so many people did this during the pandemic, and at least according to what employers were saying, and this is at the height of the pandemic in April, they're saying it went better than expected. That signals that at least many employers would be open to this. And again, the same survey of employers, they asked, as a result of COVID-19, will my organization's workforce be more remote, about the same, or less remote work? 62% said they're going to have more remote work incorporated in their organization, and 26% said significantly more remote work, right? They're going to offer that as an option for employees. Uh, you know, this, if enough of your employees do it, you save money on office space. There's lots of questions. This is a really interesting survey. I didn't put in all the questions here, but they asked, like, in what ways was it better? In what ways was it worse? And a lot of employers said my workers were just more productive. Now, some said they were less productive, but there were more employers that said my workers are more productive by working from home than they are in the office. And that was more than the number that said that people were less productive. So I think potentially, and this is really, I've got lots of question marks on these slides because this is just speculation, right? We don't know what's going to happen, but it seems possible that because maybe some people enjoyed working from home. I know a lot of people who really didn't, right? Some people who didn't and never want to do it again. And some employers say, we can't do this again. It's totally unworkable. But if a lot of people decide to do this, this could really reshape not only how the workforce looks, but how the geographic distribution of people works as far as where they live, right? Whether people live in cities or in rural areas, or whether people can actually move to more rural states, not just move out to the suburbs or the exurbs outside of, say, Washington, D.C., but can someone, I have a friend who works at a think tank in Washington, D.C., and he lives near Taos, New Mexico, because he likes to ski. And so he wants to live out there, right? And that's where his family lives out there. So he lives out there now. He's worked out an arrangement with his employer. And he flies back once a month, on his own dime. But because of how much he can save in terms of cost of living, it's way cheaper for him. So potentially more people are going to do this. So let's look at another survey. Again, these are surveys. How much can you trust them? It's just asking people. But at this point, that's the best we can do, is just ask people what they think they're going to do. This is not employers, this asks people. So this is a survey of, I think it's a pretty big survey, 20,000 people, which is pretty big. Most surveys are like 1,000 people. This is a survey of 20,000 people. And they asked them, as a result of the more ability to work from home post-COVID for yourself or someone in your household, are you planning to move out of the area you live in now? And they asked this question a number of different ways to try to, make sure they weren't framing it in an unusual way. But for most of them, they found something like 4 to 6% of those surveyed said that yes, they're either going to move or they're already going to move. So 2% of Americans surveyed said they've already moved somewhere else because of the ability now to work from home. They're like permanently bought a new house because their employers said, yeah, you can just keep doing this forever if you want. So what does that translate into? Well, if these numbers are representative of the entire country, that's 14 to 23 million Americans. That's more than 10% of the workforce has said that they are planning to move because they can work from home now. That's a significant shift in not only how we work, but potentially in how people live. And if you ask people, where are they going to move? So, and do you want to move to a more expensive area or a less expensive area, or one that's similar? As you might guess, most people said they want to move to a less expensive area, right? I mean, some people might want to move to maybe some people would want to move to a city, right? That is more expensive. But if you look at people who live in major cities, 60% of them, of those who said they're going to move, 60% said they're going to move to a less expensive area. Now, that could just mean they move out to the suburbs of the major city they're in. It could mean they move to Arkansas, right? That they could move here as a way to have a lower cost of living, maybe a different lifestyle they like better. Maybe there's someone who had left Arkansas after they finished college and they want to come back here now, right? So this data says nothing about Arkansas per se, but it's at least a potential for people to choose where they want to live, and that their job is not going to be necessarily tied to where their employer is, right? And this is consistent across the board. Wherever people live, they said they want to, in general, move to somewhere that is less expensive, which is generally what you'd expect. I mean, but I can understand the people that want to move to a more expensive place, that they say, there's a city they'd like to live in. Maybe it's more expensive, but it has more things they like. But maybe their job is tied to somewhere else, right? So some people in rural areas, this is essentially 30% of people in rural areas are saying, I'd want to move to a city, right? So people can move all different places. If these surveys are all an indication of what people will actually do, we could see significant movement of the population over the next few years and a redistribution of people throughout, both going into and out of cities and into and out of rural areas. And we could really see, there's all kinds of things that could, there's been a big discussion of, how the migration of people from the north to the south over the many decades has changed the political dynamics of the South. This could have a similar kind of effect of people moving in all sorts of different places. In some ways that might be unpredictable because we just don't know who these people are and all the things about them. But it seems like people are using this temporary opportunity of working from home to think about it as a serious thing, and not just to, work from home and kind of huddle up in your little apartment, but to think about where else could I live and how can my life be different. So is this an opportunity for Arkansas? There was a story on NPR just in December about cities that are paying people to relocate, and some cities are paying up to $10,000. Sometimes it's the city itself, but often it's like a business industry group that's trying to attract workers, right? If there are all these workers right now saying in these surveys, we might like to move somewhere, maybe that's something that now cities are trying to attract people. And this is happening in a number of cities. Tulsa, Oklahoma is doing it, but also Northwest Arkansas is actually already doing this. So the Northwest Arkansas Council, with support from the Walton Family Foundation, is offering people that want to work remotely and move to Northwest Arkansas, they're offering them a $10,000 bonus. And now you do have to, I think, stay there for a number of years or maybe buy a house, usually requirements like that. They're trying to get people to not game the system. But they're seriously thinking about, can we attract? There's all these people now. Maybe 10% of the workforce wants to relocate. They want to move to less expensive areas. Northwest Arkansas is one of the lowest cost of living places in the country that also has a high income, right? So it's a high, and we're talking mostly a little bit north of you guys in Fort Smith. We're talking about, Bentonville and Fayetteville, but even down into Fort Smith too. I mean, that's an area of the country that has way above average income, and they have below average cost of living. So this is now an attempt to track. And so for the Northwest Arkansas Council, they're not only offering them $10,000, they're offering them a bike also, a street or mountain bike in addition. So Tulsa will give you $10,000. We will give you $10,000 and a bike, because we're now trying to become the biking capital of the world. So will this work? How many people will actually move because of this? I really don't know, but I think it's a sign that, people are thinking about this, and business groups and cities and regions are thinking about how can we be positioned well to, if people want to move, to get them to come to us, right? Because offering someone $10,000, that actually might sound like a lot, especially when we have a lot of people in poverty in Arkansas. But if someone does move here and they're a high income earner and they stay here for 5 to 10 years, we're going to make it up in new tax revenue, new academic activity. So it is a significant amount of money, but I think to get them to come, and somehow $10,000 is a nice round number. It seems the number that a lot of cities have settled on as far as what they'll pay people to move there. So I don't know if we'll maybe have to ask them in a year. They just started this during the pandemic. I think they've been talking about it for a while, and they said, "Oh, we got to do this now. We got to start this program we've been talking about." That will be something that I think for me as an economist, just so interesting to think about all the economic and social changes that might result from people moving. And if you're going to move, where do you want to go? Maybe you want to come to Arkansas. So I think that's something that's worth at least thinking about that for the future. So that was about all I had, at least in terms of the slides. There's a lot more. If you have questions about things related, I have always a million things I could try to talk about, but I do thank you all for listening tonight, and thanks for the questions so far. And I look forward to answering any other questions that you have. So thank you very much.
2 questions. First, would the movement have the effect of changing some of this rural-urban divide that's driving our politics so much right now? And also, would it sort of create pressure to get services like broadband out into a rural area?
Yeah, I mean, it really could. I mean, some people might want to, move to Bentonville and live right on the town square there. But I think some people might want to move and buy an acreage in Arkansas. And I think that, a big necessity for someone to work remotely is obviously a good internet connection. So, in the state, we've had a rural broadband initiative that's been working on a number of years, but Governor Hutchinson has kind of ramped it up recently and really tried to get that. It's not everywhere yet, but as a real big policy initiative, that will be, increasingly important if you don't want to just attract people to the cities, but if you want to attract people to come and, buy a plot of land, outside the city. You do need, you can't, I've had even, teaching my classes, even students that are in Conway, if you don't have a good internet connection, like I can't even understand them talking, right? Like you do need a good internet connection to do video conferencing. It will not just work on the cheapest, Conway Corp plan that we have here in Conway. You do need, and we've upgraded our internet too during the pandemic because, you do need a solid connection, and not only to do video conferencing, but to do some of the the different types of, because so much work is being done on the cloud now, right? You do need a good internet connection to be constantly connected if you want to be a remote worker, right? If you don't, maybe the cheap connection's fine, but for a remote worker, and they're willing to pay for a good connection, but in rural parts of the state, that's not available everywhere yet. So that's kind of the one of the things that I think is now being even increasingly thought about as something we need to get moving on.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Pat.
Okay. I have one comment and then one question. The comment is Arkansas Valley Electric has been putting in a fiber optics network called WAVE. And they're taking their current superstructure, which is all those telephone poles, and stringing fiber optic cable.
Mhm.
And people around here in Crawford County, which is a very rural county, are very, very excited. It may be because their gaming is better, but it really is a big event that we're getting such fast internet.
Yeah, that's
So-
great. Yeah.
And then the question I have is, one of your statements was that consumer spending appeared to rebound and sustain itself as an outcome of the stimulus payments. Is this whole pandemic thing kind of by accident, a statement of trickle down, or a conflict between trickle down and stimulus approaches by economists? Because Jeff was asking me the other day, how can we continue to spend money when we have such a high deficit? And we've been trained to think of spending money we don't have is a bad thing. So what comments do you have on those subjects?
Those are great questions and thoughts. Yeah, I mean, how to when there was a recession, because 2020 has been unusual, but you have a recession in this country every 5 to 10 years, and most countries do. And so there's a big question of, what should the government do to try to either shorten the length of that recession, or at least to support people during the recession. And this time we've seen massive injection of money across the board to people that we've just never done before, right? Increasing support for the unemployed, and then also just the additional checks for everyone. I mean, that's been done a little bit in past recessions, but never kind of on this scale. And I think we certainly see that some of that has helped to stimulate spending. We did see in states like Arkansas, which didn't have a lot of restrictions on business, a lot of the consumer spending had already come back before the stimulus payments happened. But if we were to look at other states like New York, maybe, that had been hit the hardest, back in the spring, the payments probably did help, right? And certainly, without those payments, total spending in the economy would have taken a lot longer to come back. So I think a lot of economists are going to look at this and to say, how does this tell us how we fight just a normal recession, right? Do we need to have different kinds of policies? But I think the question about the deficit and the national debt is important because to make all those payments, we've incurred massive amounts of debt in the past year. So in calendar year 2020, we added about $4.5 trillion to the national debt. And that doesn't even include the most recent deal which is going to be another $2 trillion. Let me just, I actually wrote an article about this for a magazine recently. Let's get some in the waiting room.
When you say another 2 trillion, are you thinking that it's the package that is on the table right now that
Yeah.
may pass sometime in the next 4 weeks or so?
Yeah, I think that's something like that is likely to pass soon. And, that'll be another $2 trillion. And that'll be all additional debt because, none of the normal government operations are down, right? So any new spending is all new debt because the existing budget already had for the past few years, our existing federal budget had a $1 trillion deficit just built into it. So any new spending for the pandemic is all new debt. That's something we always should be at least thinking about. So I'm going to post here in the comments an article I just wrote. This was just 2 weeks ago in Texas CEO magazine. I write for them occasionally. I have a friend who's the editor there, and whenever they need a column at the last minute, they say, "What do you got?" So here, you guys can read that some other time. But here's an article I wrote, just kind of thinking about the national debt and how should we think about that, both in the context of the current recession, but also just generally and how much that should be in our thinking. So you can save that link for later to read. But great questions. Thank you, Pat.
Other questions to Jeremy?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Taria. Hi, Dr. Horpedal.
Hi.
So I noticed when you mentioned that Texas, their economy had not rebounded as well as Arkansas, my first thought was maybe their reliance on oil, and a large part of their economy is based on that. And I know that there's been a lot of talk recently about just taking a moment in this pandemic to maybe think about whether or not we want to return to normal, or maybe take this opportunity to create a new normal, especially in terms of our reliance on fossil fuels. And so my question is, what areas of industry, what parts of the economy do you see changing or emerging going forward as a result of this pandemic?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. I think you're probably right that, for Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma, because they are, have natural resource fossil fuels as such a big part of their economy, and demand for those has been down, right? Because people aren't traveling as much, people aren't driving as much. I mean, it's come back a little now, but even those are still down. So that might be part of what's holding them back, right? So I don't want to say that that Texas is just doing worse than us overall. So that might be part of why they're so low right now. But I think that might be a sector of the economy that might be permanently, right? If what I'm saying is true, if 10% of the population is now working from home more, that's a lot less commuting. And so that might mean a permanent decrease in the demand for some fossil fuels. I can only speculate about how the economy might change, but I think one way that might change is people always want to be entertained and have entertainment of various forms, but how might people's, the form of entertainment that they consume, how might that change, right? If people are now, happy with, getting their movies streamed to them rather than going out to a movie, are people going to want to go? I mean, some people really do want to go back and go out to see live music and live concerts and see plays. But some people might, have again, like I said, with the eating out at restaurants, they might think, well, that actually costs a lot of money. And a lot of my friends are saying, people that haven't lost their jobs are saying, wow, I've saved so much money during this pandemic. Like my whole life, I've been trying to figure out how can I save money? And it just, just don't eat out as much and don't spend quite as much on entertainment. And that's, if a lot of people have that attitude going forward now that, I finally figured out how to balance my budget and save a little bit because we had this shock to our system, that might mean that for some people, that'll be a permanent change. So I think that, how people get their entertainment or what people even consider entertainment, right? If people are now more interested in gaming and they need the high-speed connection for that, but they don't need to go out to just maybe, sporting events as much, that's a possibility. Again, this is all speculation on my part. But I think that those are the type of changes that might come out as a result of this. So I think, with people working from home more, clearly that'll affect fossil fuels. If people travel less, that'll affect those industries. But I think how people get their entertainment is the one I think about as being could be a big change. Thank you for that question.
And
Hi, this is Ashwant Reddy. I just have a comment from a physician standpoint. So over these last few months, when I see any new patients and I ask them like, where they come from and what they were doing before, and I saw a lot of patients who moved from different states to Arkansas. They are retired and they were mostly from western states, and I think the pandemic was like a breaking point and people started moving. You talked a lot about moving, Jeremy. So just a thought, even people who are not working, who are retired, they decided to move to a place. And one reason they said why they moved to Fort Smith, because I was curious why they moved from all the way from outside Seattle to Fort Smith, and they said cost of living. So that was one of the important things. Most of them said cost of living was the reason they moved closer to Fort Smith, and they had some connection. They said, my dad used to work here many years ago. My aunt used to live there. My family lives in Oklahoma, and they were looking for a place with a hospital closer, and just as the thought from a physician standpoint. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think people are always thinking about that, retiring, move somewhere lower cost of living. But I think just this past year has made a lot of people just reevaluate things and think about, this is, again, it relates to my point about how people get their entertainment. But, living in a big city, a big part of what you're paying for is access to all kinds of entertainment, nice restaurants and concerts and plays every night of the week. And you start thinking, how much do I really take advantage of this? Or do I really, only need access to these things occasionally? And so that's a big part of what you're paying for, is being part of that culture. And some people love that and are willing to pay for it. But I think some people are starting to think about, do I really need to be living in some place that has access to all these cultural amenities constantly? Or, can I just take trips to Seattle instead, right? With all the money I'm saving, I could go to Seattle, every 6 months and enjoy it, and then go back home to my, most of us just sit at home most of the time anyway in the evening. So
yeah, you hit the right point. I used to live outside Boston for 4 years, and how many times I went to Boston? Like 4 times. So yeah.
Yeah, and from Northwest Arkansas, I think they have flights. You can fly directly to New York City, and you can fly to LA. I mean, you just drive up to the Northwest Arkansas Airport. So yeah, you have connections here to all the major cultural centers of the country, which are great. I love them, but I'm happy living in Arkansas too.
just a quick question, Kenneth. Do we have any activity on Facebook at all?
I'm not seeing any questions on there. We have some viewers, but no questions.
Pat sent me a fascinating column this morning. You go back and forth about the impact of the stimulus, and The Economist this morning was making the argument that you don't think about the stimulus so much in terms of trying to make up lost ground as in targeting specific needs and focusing on things like vaccines and, of course, controversially, state and local government and all that kind of stuff. Could you just reflect a little on the impact of the stimulus, how thinking about that might be changing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. There's a lot of debate about this among economists about whether we should be trying to use this next government spending package to stimulate the economy, or if now is not actually the time for that, because for people that haven't lost their jobs and have been saving money for the past year, like, they have money to spend. They want to know the pandemic is over before they start really going out and spending money in the way they did before. So this question among economists of whether you should target the aid as best as possible to people who have been negatively affected, right? Lots of people, there's still 10 million people that are unemployed compared to before the pandemic. Should we try to target more money towards them? Should we try to target it towards other things like vaccines, right? So, I mean, we spend a lot of money on vaccines. I think we're doing a pretty good job on that, better than almost any other country. But, of this proposed aid package, the $1.9 trillion, only 1% of that spending is going to vaccines. Now, I don't know what the exact right number is, but when this seems like to be the thing to get us out of the pandemic, only spending 1% of the aid proposed on vaccines. I mean, I don't know if it was 10%, how much faster does that get the vaccines out? But it seems like any way you can get them out faster now is totally worth it. So whether that means more production or better distribution, it seems strange to me that 1% of it is on vaccines. But I mean, my opinion is we should be trying as much to target it to people that have been negatively impacted, and because of all the debt we've taken on, and because the economy doesn't really need to be stimulated right now. I mean, maybe it will need to be in July when we've got enough people vaccinated, but I think we should, as best we can, not give it to everyone. The challenge though is that, how do you know who's been affected? I mean, they're using people's income from past years to try to estimate, who should get these checks. When they did this back in March, and then when they did it again in December, the argument was you got to get the money out quick. And the way to get it out quick is just to give it to everyone, right? And then you can figure out later if we need to take some of it back from people who weren't actually affected. So that's one way to do it, I think, is to kind of do both those things, right? Is to say, we're going to give it to everyone, but if your income in 2020 was not actually lower than it was in 2019, you're going to have to give that back when you pay your taxes. I mean, that's one way we could do it, is to say, give it to everyone because that's the easiest way to do it, or almost everyone, right? With the same income cutoffs they did before, which means basically 95% of people are going to get some sort of a check, right? Again, this is like, we got the $1,200 checks that were issued in January, and now they're talking about another, 1,400 is kind of the number they're talking about now, but whatever it might be, that one way to do both those things, to try to help as many people as possible that need it, but then to not increase the deficit even more, is to structure the law, I would say, so that people that actually weren't adversely affected, and you can know by looking at their income at the end of the year that they don't need this money, so make them give it back. Politically, that's difficult because once you give someone money, it's hard to take it back. But as an economist, I can just say, do this and not worry about the politics of it, and maybe they'll do it. But it's a good question. It's a big challenge.
Other questions, as folks listen and think? Lot of information tonight. Are we good? Then this has been a lot to think about, and for fear of losing the link, I've already got the article open to read sometime this evening, because I don't know how to go back and get the link once it's gone. So I've already got it open. Thank you so much for the time you put into preparing this and for sharing your time with us this evening. I know I'm taking away a lot. And unless there are other questions, I believe we are ready to say good evening.
Yeah, well, thank you so much again for inviting me. I'm glad I was able to. Hopefully, I didn't throw too much data at you, but if whatever you picked up, hopefully it'll make you think about something a little more deeply. So thank you all for listening, and I hope everyone's staying safe and warm out there.
Amen. I got to shovel my drive tonight, but other than that, it's all good.
Okay.
Or this morning, rather. Good night, all.
Bye, everyone.